Inspiring the hearts and minds of your clinical trial team requires purposeful and creative planning, and training is a contributor to the success of clinical trials and your ability to bring life-changing medicines to patients faster. So, to boost effectiveness, think of your clinical trial as a learning journey rather than an event. So, for the next 50 or so minutes, we'll walk through planning steps to identify critical elements for designing a clinical trial training journey with impact. And although our examples we'll reference today are tailored to clinical trials, the learning steps and suggestions could really apply to any other industry learning initiatives. With that, hi everyone, I'm Heather Holleran. I'm a Senior Solutions Consultant at Tier 1 Performance, where I've been now for the last 13 years. The roles I often play are learning strategist, engagement manager, and solution architect. And although I've worked across many segments in the last 25 or plus years of my career, the last 4 years I've been working with Matt and Meredith on in our life sciences area.
I'm Meredith Kipp. I'm a senior consultant at Tier 1. I've been here for about 5 years, and I've been working as a learning strategist and instructional designer, mostly with life sciences and healthcare clients in that time, with a primary focus on clinical trials.
And hi, everyone. I'm Matt Krager. I've been with Tier 1 for about 5 years now. I'm one of our life sciences delivery directors. So our team's dedicated to our life sciences clients. I am also a senior solutions consultant with my background in creative strategy and design, as well as engagement management. And again, along with Heather and Meredith, have been very focused on our life sciences clients, but particularly our clinical trial work, again, almost exclusively for the last 5 years or so. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here today and share a little bit of what we've learned along the way.
All right. So our agenda for today is we're going to start off by reviewing some common challenges with clinical trial training support. We'll move into some of the risks associated with poor clinical trial training. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time going through our best practices and our overall approach. And we will have time at the end for Q&A. So, feel free along the way to drop a comment or a question in. We will monitor it and we will answer those at the end. All right, so let's start with some common challenges with clinical trial training. So there are several challenges. We're just going to highlight some of these here today. So faster turnaround to market. So the need to get your product to the marketplace in a very competitive market is definitely a challenge. The speed to market and the speed to get people trained efficiently and effectively is getting faster and faster. The high staff turnover. So with frequent staff changes, it necessitates continuous training, which can be a resource intensive. Getting the right people involved can be a challenging, particularly the subject matter experts. So coordination of study teams is definitely a challenge. The technology barriers. So integrating and maintaining up-to-date training technologies and platforms requires significant investment and expertise. I think one behind here. Okay. The customized and tailored content. So tailoring training materials to suit different roles and expertise levels within the trial team can be complex. Sometimes you have to deal with language barriers and accessibility barriers. So conducting training in multiple languages to accommodate global trial sites and making sure it's accessible for all learners adds another layer of difficulty. And then the last one, knowledge retention. So ensuring that trainees retain and correctly apply the knowledge gained during training is a constant concern.
Yeah, so what are the risks if we don't address these challenges? The top risk is patient safety concerns. Poorly trained staff may mishandle patient care, leading to adverse events and potentially jeopardizing patient safety. Can also lead to data integrity issues. Inconsistent training can lead to errors in data collection and reporting, which can compromise the integrity of trial results. Inefficiencies and errors due to inadequate training can increase operational costs and even potentially prolong trial timelines. And those longer timelines could open the door for other competitors or other sponsors to reach FDA approval more quickly than your organization. And over time, these repeated issues stemming from poor training can damage the reputation of an organization, which can in turn affect future trial participation and partnerships. Untrained or poorly trained staff can slow down trial processes, leading to delays and reduced productivity. And then training that is overly lengthy or irrelevant to certain audiences can lead to staff dissatisfaction and disengagement, and that can also lead to higher staff turnover. And all of these taken together can lead to a failure to adhere to regulatory guidelines and standards, which can result in legal issues, in fines, and potentially even the shutdown of certain trials. So the stakes are definitely high, but thankfully we have a potential solution.
Yeah, and so to help mitigate those risks we just talked about, and in doing so, addressing some of these challenges head on, we've developed this approach for how we would recommend developing your clinical trial training. That again, as Heather mentioned a little bit earlier, looks a little bit more like a journey rather than that single training event. And that journey is instead like really laser focused on what are those critical elements within your study that are anchored to the overall objectives, so that we can handle these challenges. And this approach really strives to have all training be designed in support of accelerating the capture of that timely and accurate study data in order to ultimately improve patient outcomes. And so our 8-step approach that we're going to be talking about through today starts with defining your vision and success. Then we'll discuss assembling your support team. We'll talk about completing an audience analysis so that we can ultimately define your learning strategy. And within that, we'll be able to identify your learning objectives. We'll also talk about templatizing your content, which we can also move on to selecting your modalities. And lastly, we'll talk about delivering and soliciting feedback. And so to start, we'll kick things off with number 1, defining your vision of success.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so if you want to keep your learning journey grounded and aligned to the business objectives, it's imperative to define what success looks like. So that is step number 1, define your vision of success. So take a minute to consider, how will you know if the clinical trial training is a success? What quantitative metrics will you use to measure success? And you'll see here there's a few different examples. A couple just to call out. One could be reducing inadvertent enrollment. So a patient needs to qualify to be in the trial, and if somebody doesn't qualify but makes it through, you're spending time with someone whose data won't count, and it can slow you down. Another example is participant or patient retention. So they have to make it to the end of treatment for their data to count, or it counts more if they make it through the study. So a measure could be to reduce your drop rate. Another consideration is what qualitative mechanisms are in place for soliciting feedback directly from your target audience. So do you have a ability to survey? Can you conduct focus groups? Can you solicit feedback directly during site visits? So all questions to consider as you're defining your vision of success. And to provide a repeatable and scalable approach to conducting training for clinical trials, establish a centralized core team or department that's aligned on best practices for the creation and delivery of training materials. So that's planning step number 2, assemble your support team. So a core team creates consistency for how sites deliver training, which ensures that learners experience a similar training process for every trial, ultimately shortening their time to proficiency. And even though treatment indications vary from trial to trial, there are content and training components that are either the same or very similar across clinical trials. So for example, how to use devices or how to conduct labs. So having a core team focused on content creation and delivery ensures that all learners use the same material when applicable, which reduces unnecessary time and money spent on recreating assets for new trials. The time saved through using consistent content creation and delivery methods creates more time to invest in customizing materials for new audiences and scaling the trial. So to stand up a centralized core team, consider whether you have the experts in the following areas. First, learning. Do you have folks who can be in the roles of learning strategists, instructional designers, or even rapid authoring developers who can design and develop the identified deliverables? Do you have someone who can be a communication specialist who can plan, write, and deploy any necessary messaging either before or during a trial? Do you have technical experts who can determine a learning platform that aligns with your training ecosystem to deploy and store trial training assets? And then do you have a project manager who can help ensure that all these different components are delivered and deployed on time and within your budget? In addition to these roles, also consider who's going to contribute to your overall clinical trial content. So for example, who are your subject matter experts that can answer questions regarding the trial protocol or within functional areas such as labs or data? So feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are shaped through experiences. And to influence behavior by creating thoughtful experiences, you must first understand your learner groups and consider their daily activities and their challenges. So step 3 is to complete audience analysis. Start by identifying those various audience groups that need to be trained on the trial and the roles within each of these audience groups. So you'll see there's some role examples here, like primary or sub-investigators, study coordinators or site staff, data specialists or lab technicians, participants or caregivers, if that's applicable to your organization. Or perhaps instead of training people at the facility, you're focused on those who visit the sites, like the clinical research analyst. So regardless of your audience, consider the following questions as you think about your audience group. What does the learner's typical day look like? What tasks or responsibilities do they have? And what are their challenges and barriers to clinical trial training success?
Thanks, Heather. So now we're moving into defining your learning strategy. So for something as important as a clinical trial, there's often a push to include extensive, comprehensive training prior to first participant visit. But as learning experts, we know that humans can't retain all that information throughout a months or years-long clinical trial. So instead, we propose delivering that content in phases or in moments, which allows us to prioritize the most critical, high-impact information and connect what learners need to know with when they need to know it based on their individual role and tasks. So for any given clinical trial protocol, it's often split up into different study periods, and you could even break those down into more specific moments that could be good for training interventions. So it could start with recruitment, maybe screening, enrollment, that randomization visit or the first dose visit. Sometimes there's an escalation phase and a maintenance phase within the treatment period. Sometimes there's an observation phase or an open label extension, and there's almost always a safety follow-up period as well. So then within each of those moments, you could break down the different types of content, the different critical topics that you want to be sure to cover. Then you want to ask yourself, what is the impact of this content? Could it potentially impact the trial, data integrity, patient safety? What happens if that procedure isn't done correctly, for instance? And then finally, you want to identify which roles need to know that information and what are their specific responsibilities. So by breaking down each critical topic into these 4 different areas, it helps us avoid something generic like we need to cover dose modification. Instead, this forces you to probe a little bit further, forces you to ask, what moment does this apply to? What is the impact? And who needs to know about this topic and when? So it helps us avoid that kitchen sink approach to training. Because as much as we love working with our medical leads, they are very brilliant and dedicated people. If you ask a medical lead what the most important part of a trial is, they're going to point to the entire protocol, all 100 pages of it. And so our goal as learning experts is to really break down and simplify the protocol and to reinforce it through training rather than just repeating it. So to help explore this a little further, we'll show you an example. We can move to the next screen. So here we have a potential content topic, the MRI procedure. So we have a hypothetical trial here that includes 5 different MRIs throughout the trial. So there's one that happens during screening that has an impact on eligibility. There are 3 that occur during the treatment period, and those have to be reviewed before each dosing visit. It helps monitor patient safety and also determines the participant's dose level. And then we also have a follow-up period MRI, which is actually tied to the primary endpoint and secondary endpoint of overall safety and efficacy. And then there are also unscheduled MRIs that may occur as needed. They also may not occur. They're not really tied to any specific moment of the trial. So let's see how we could apply our learning strategy to this hypothetical trial. So first we have the screening period MRI. It has to be reviewed before randomization and dosing, and the results impact inclusion and exclusion criteria. So if that MRI is not done correctly, if the results aren't reviewed adequately, it could lead to inadvertent enrollment, where a participant who shouldn't be eligible for the trial still enters the trial anyway. So we really try to reduce that as much as possible. So the role that's most impacted by this is the principal investigator. Since they are overseeing the full trial, they're making sure that only eligible participants are entering the trial. They really need to know a lot of information about this screening period MRI. And then next we have our treatment period MRIs. These need to be centrally read and reviewed 7 days prior to each dosing visit. So we have a very specific protocol-defined window in which this MRI must occur. And it has several different impacts. It impacts the dose level the participant receives during that visit, but also if the MRI does not occur within the proper window, it would be a protocol deviation. And then certain visits might need to be rescheduled, which could ultimately lengthen the trial beyond what the sponsor wants. So while this does impact the PI as well, Here, the really key thing is the timing of these MRIs. So training will probably focus on the study coordinator and site staff who are actually scheduling that MRI throughout the treatment period. And then next we have our unscheduled MRIs, which may occur at the investigator's discretion based on adverse events. So these impact patient safety, which is an extremely important topic. So obviously the principal investigator needs to know a lot about these unscheduled MRIs. It might be important to inform site staff as well, since they might be called on to schedule these MRIs. So because this is so important, it impacts patient safety. This is something we'd probably choose to cover early and often in training. So it might be reinforced by other resources down the road, not just covered in that initial upfront training before first participant visit. And then finally, we have our follow-up period MRI. This one relates to a key study objective and endpoint, which means it's really important that the data is entered correctly in the electronic database. If it's not entered correctly or in a timely manner, again, that could impact data integrity. It could also lengthen the trial or delay database lock, which means the results of the trial are released later, and you could just see the impacts on the timeline further down the road. It could delay FDA approval. It could mean another sponsor gets their drug to market first. So that would probably be primarily for site staff, since again, it comes down to the importance of scheduling and also accurately entering data. So just kind of taking a step back from all of this. Can we go back one slide? Sorry. Thank you. So here we just have one topic, the MRI procedure, but we're covering it in multiple different moments in different ways. It has a different impact at each of these moments, and it also affects different roles as well. So instead of giving all of this to every single role at the front of the trial, we're splitting it up based on who needs to know it and when throughout the course of the clinical trial. All right, and then the next step to really hone in on this learning strategy is to identify our learning objectives. So it's not just enough to know about the different moments and the different critical topics. You really need to analyze what your audience needs to know in order for the trial to be successful, what they need to do, so the specific skills and abilities they need to have, or the procedures they need to perform for that trial to be successful. And finally, what they need to believe, so the different mindsets that you want your audience to have. And I feel like that's one that tends to kind of get left to the wayside in a lot of clinical trial training because it's so medical and scientific. But it really is such an important part of how humans learn, is making sure we're putting them in the right mindset and that they understand how important this work is for the trial. So to go back to our MRI procedure example, if you can imagine a study coordinator at a site, someone who's organizing all these different MRI schedules, what they need to know is that there will be 5 MRIs within the study and that they all occur within different phases. They need to be scheduled ahead of time and that they all have their own specific protocol-defined windows. So what the study coordinator needs to do, they need to know how to schedule that MRI. They also need to inform participants, when the MRI is taking place. Often, like the MRI procedure might be on a different floor or in a totally different facility from the clinical site. So making sure you set those expectations, make sure participants know where they're going and when. If there are any other considerations, like if they have to fast before the MRI, making sure they understand those expectations as well. So ultimately, they just need to coordinate all of the logistics around the MRI. But what they need to believe that the participant experience is important, and that they play a really big role in that too. And that if a participant is having a negative experience in the trial, it might not encourage them to stay in the trial throughout the full duration. So scheduling MRIs properly, keeping participants informed, making sure everything is within the protocol window so that it doesn't have to be rescheduled later. All of that makes a really big impact on the overall participant experience and really the overall clinical trial. So we always try to put into our training that their efforts matter, like what site staff, what principal investigators, everyone involved in the trial, what they do really has an impact, not just on the data and the science, but also on the participants and their families who are taking part in that trial. So even within just this one procedure, there's all sorts of different learning objectives that we want to cover and be sure to address in the training. And it also helps you evaluate the success of your training if you're able to identify these objectives ahead of time. So with that, we'll move on to templatizing.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. And going off script here, I got a little goosebumps hearing you say how much it's important to reinforce how much the efforts of all of these learners, how much it matters. I know that's something we definitely prioritize with the training we create. But I think it's so important to connect to ultimately what is going to help lead to study success. And so whatever we can do here to make that connection for them is all the better. And so we're kind of shifting gears here. So we've talked a little bit already about our learning strategy. We've got the objectives ironed out, have assessed those key moments, the content, the impact, and roles. Now it's kind of time to start thinking about the content itself for the learning assets. And this is where we can start to recognize some efficiencies from trial to trial, because there may be elements that are similar or even identical. And that's where templatizing your content can come in. And so, again, it's somewhat self-explanatory, but rather than recreating these assets over and over again, for every new trial that comes down to pike, there may be ways that you can create templates to help accelerate that development process. Again, while still achieving your trial-specific objectives. So in some cases, there may be content that can even wholesale be reused from one study to the next. And these, I guess, agnostic assets are worth cataloging early so you can like more quickly leverage those existing materials down the road, and instead start to shift your focus and shift your prioritization on the things that are truly unique or particularly challenging for just that study that you're creating new training for. And so, for example, you might have heard this already today. If you already have materials explaining how to use a particular device or how to collect certain labs, there's no reason to start from scratch for every study. And so this is where, as Heather mentioned earlier, that support team can be especially helpful because they have that centralized bird's eye view of everything that's been developed in the past, and ideally can quickly connect those dots to things that can be reused for your study. So those know, do, believe items, if we've created something before, maybe we can accelerate pulling them into the training for this new study. You can go to the next one, Heather. And similarly, by templatizing your content, even down to certain page layouts or interaction types, you can more easily import study-specific information into what has already proven to be a reliable convention in the past for achieving those learning objectives. So when you think of the outline of a trial protocol, it typically follows a similar format from study to study. And knowing with this structure in mind, you could design page layouts that could be used across trials, knowing that certain elements are always going to be relevant. And so here, for example, although the criteria for inclusion, exclusion, and considering eligibility is going to vary from trial to trial, that topic is almost always going to be critically important. Again, back to the whole enrollment topic. So maybe having a page template for this content eliminates the need to reinvent the wheel every time or to create a new page for every trial. And again, depending on which teams are involved, this just helps with that process and speeds up time for training launch. And also, I guess secondarily, again, allows more time for the team to customize the materials in other ways and prioritizing those learning objectives we defined earlier that are, again, especially unique or critical for study success. So if you have this patient eligibility interaction already developed, for the one study that has that MRI procedure and is relevant for eligibility and inclusion exclusion, that can be a way to quickly pull that content in to develop a certain patient scenario. Whereas for another study, that content may be adjusted, but at least you have this template in place so that you can move quickly through the training development process. And so again, with those objectives defined, your content priorities are set. You have some templates that maybe you can leverage going forward, at least from how you may want to train on the content. This is where the modality that you choose for the learning can be also especially crucial. So your clinical trial learning strategy could utilize numerous effective delivery methods and training techniques. There's no shortage to choose from. But again, going back to the prioritization is important because it highlights items that, as Meredith said, may be a low impact or a high impact. So items on the low impact side, go ahead, Heather. The low impact side of the spectrum, they may only warrant a communication to remind learners that something may not necessarily need to be committed to memory. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, for the high impact, maybe this is multiple interventions, maybe multiple different types of modalities to have a variety. But then also perhaps those are spaced out at different moments. So that's where the whole moment objective process is helpful, because you can identify how to reinforce that content at key moments throughout the study appropriately. So we think that a blended approach that incorporates more than one modality to deliver content can help increase retention. And this approach is fundamentally based on understanding this low and high impact spectrum for your content. So here, I won't read everything on the screen for you, but as we're talking about selecting your modalities, this table shows some examples based on how you can flow from left to right with what starts with those common learning objectives. And so at the top, we've got that locate information. And again, the implication here is that the learner just needs to know where to find this content and how to read or interpret it. But again, you don't need to commit it to memory necessarily. So this is where the modality of a communication or job aid may be sufficient. But as you add additional complexity to your objectives, so moving down the left column, building knowledge or awareness, develop understanding, building and sharpening skills, and then applying those skills, the modality then may need to match that complexity. But ultimately, the reminder here is that the content and learning objectives drive the modality selected, and not vice versa, where you may want to select your delivery method. It may be the new sexy thing, or it's what we've always done, but ultimately the content should drive the modality, and the objective should drive the modality versus the modality causing the content to have to fit the confines of that choice. So our last one here is deliver and solicit feedback, which kind of covers two sides of the same coin. So an important aspect of developing an effective learning strategy is considering the type of learning platform needed to deliver the training. And so there's some questions to start to think about what is the best, yeah, go ahead, Heather. Thank you. The best way for delivering that training. And although a single platform may not meet all learner needs, it's important to start to understand how different platforms can improve this overall learning ecosystem that they'll be engaging with. because ultimately your deliverables may be really well designed. We've just talked through this whole approach of audience analysis and strategy and objectives, and it may be so perfectly tailored and created, but if the learning platform itself is clunky in its rollout or in the experience that learners will have, then you're just going to lose a lot of these expected gains that again ultimately impact the success of the trial. And so that's where our team has done a lot of work in thinking through this overall learning ecosystem and how it can be the best experience for maybe not that single training event, but thinking of it again as a journey. What needs to be in place so that people can go back to it over and over again throughout those key moments. And then on the flip side, you also want to know if the learning itself, so again, we've assumed that the training we've created is as effective as possible. But and ultimately, this is to help improve the overall strategy execution going forward for trials. But as the world continues to evolve, as studies get more complex, as trials move faster and faster, it's worth taking time to see if the approach is meeting the learners where they are. And so establishing mechanisms within your learning ecosystem for getting that feedback periodically throughout a trial. This could be through surveys, focus groups, again, maybe even split out by roles across a variety of sites or even internally. It could be just a giant provide feedback button in your learning management system. But all of this feedback, all this information will only enhance your design process to meet learners' needs in the future. And so gathering that feedback is a critical piece as well. So with that, we've come to the end of our 8 steps in our standard approach here to designing and developing clinical trial training. Again, with the goal of fueling clinical trial success. Meredith mentioned it earlier. We're trying to make that connection to their efforts. Our learners' efforts are crucially important and matter. And so the best thing we can do is help train them as effectively as possible. And that takes serious planning and may even require significant changes within your organization. But with a well-executed learning strategy, it can help be the difference between producing more accurate and timely data that ultimately informs the efficacy of a new treatment. And so I know Katie has been posting in our chat that we have a link to our clinical trial success landing page that has both our activation guide as well as some other resources, and the recording of today's webinar will live there as well. But we thank you all so very much for your attention today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll take a minute to answer them for you. I don't think I saw any so far.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, Matt or Meredith. But so we could either wrap up, or if there's any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the group.
Nothing else for me other than I think, the 3 of us have had a lot of time working with clients within this specific area of clinical trial training. And we know that it encompasses not just training as well. So while we talked through this support, this is a very complex process that involves a lot of people and a lot of teams. And there's certainly an organizational element to how a company works internally and then works externally, and it can be a complex process. But when done right, it can lead to really great results. And I know, not to speak on everyone's behalf, but I get really excited to see how a company's focused on improving the lives of other people and being a part of supporting that process however we can. So looks like maybe a question just came over. What is the one thing that causes clinical trials to go sideways? What are other areas that Tier 1 can assist with the life sciences area?
I have the thought on the first one. So not so much clinical trials themselves, but when it comes to developing training, one thing we didn't bring up in our presentation is what happens when there's a protocol amendment, which I feel like happens more often than not. And often we are in a position where we're starting to develop training before there's an FDA-approved protocol. So we're often working from a draft. We know that some items might be changing down the line. And then if there is an amendment later, we kind of have to scramble to figure out how to update our training. And if we've already split it up into different moments, we need to make sure that we're adjusting the training the same way throughout each different module or modality. So just when it comes to developing the training itself, that's something we have to be really agile and open to. We know that changes are going to be coming, and we just need to know how to handle it along the way. But that is one other great part of our approach, is that because we split it up into moments, oftentimes that training or those resources are saved for a little further along in the trial anyway, so we can update it in real time when those changes come our way.
And to answer the second question about other areas where we can assist in life sciences, we have and continue to do a lot of product launches. So within the life sciences space, if that's something that is relevant to your area. But we've also, done a number of things from technology rollouts to big change management initiatives, communication strategies. So, really whatever the need is, and we have assisted in other areas within life sciences, but product launches is another big area as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Matt, Meredith, and Heather, for sharing your expertise today. Like they mentioned, and like I said in the chat, everyone will receive a link to the recording, and it will also live on that landing page, and we'll share that on social media as well. All right. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
All right. Thank you.
all.
Thanks, everyone.